CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The 2019 World Economic Forum brought together leaders from government and the private sector in Davos under the theme Globalization 4.0, shaping a new architecture in the age of the fourth industrial revolution. Now, key issues such as climate change and the development of technology were discussed. However, the conference also raised questions about the future of inclusive globalization and multilateralism. It was also notable that fewer world leaders attended the forum as compared to previous years. This week, we look at some of the outcomes of the conference and ask if there is indeed a changing world economic order. And where does Africa fit into this? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. The World Economic Forum generated debate on multilateralism and the challenges to global economic development over the last few decades. Now, participants also looked ahead at policies that could shape more inclusive globalization for the future. Let's hear from some world leaders and get their thoughts on a changing world economic order.
In recent years, problems in the global economy, such as lack of new growth drivers, unbalanced development, and uneven income distribution, have intensified. New challenges brought by new technologies, new industries, and new forms of business have mounted. Many countries are increasingly looking inward when making policies. Barriers to international trade and investment are increasing, and unilateralism, protectionism, and populism are spreading in the world. All these are posing serious challenges to the international order. Will economic globalization move forward or reverse course?
We are facing populist challenges. There are nationalist forces, and we have to go up against them. And perhaps this will make the battle clearer and stronger. And so I, with the members of my government, will fight with all our strength that the multilateral order doesn't end with the European Union, but becomes a force that can find answers to the new challenges. But for this to happen, we of course cannot drive the existing orders so far into the ground that no one believes new options anymore.
International cooperation is indispensable. It was the brutality of the two world wars that gave rise to the multilateral system, which lately seems to be in crisis, as the World Economic Forum has been highlighting. But reforming the system should not mean a return to the status quo. For many of us, it was hardly a golden age. Rulemaking was not inclusive, and the balancing of geopolitical interests among major powers often came at a very high price for those on the periphery. For Africa, the most important thing is to adopt a posture of active responsibility toward shaping our place in the world.
Well, joining me now to unpack the World Economic Forum in a changing world, Professor Qinduo from Beijing. He is a senior fellow at the Pangual Institution. From Brussels, we have Geert Laporte. He's the Deputy Director of the European Center for Development Policy Management. And in Nairobi, we have Ken Gichinga, the Chief Economist at Mentoria Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start first by looking at the just ended World Economic Forum in Davos. Geert Laporte, WEF in Davos generally convenes leaders to discuss global and industry matters and set the agenda for the coming year. But this year, the conversation was more about which leaders were not there, more than the leaders that were there. Is the World Economic Forum losing priority? Is this significant at all that there were not that many global leaders on the stage?
Well, I think it's a clear sign of what The Economist has described last week as the globalization. The steam is getting out a little bit of globalization, and we are witnessing a very confusing period, particularly in the so-called Western world. There is a lack of leadership at this moment coming out from the United States. Europe is still very much committed to a global agenda and to a multilateral agenda, but it is really at this stage not having the capacity to really make a difference. The European Union, as you know, is divided on many issues. We are struggling with the Brexit issue. The leadership of Mrs. Merkel will soon disappear from the scene, and she was probably the strongest European leader. Countries like Italy, Hungary and others are struggling with rising populism. I think we need to look now as to how to redress the balance a bit, because those who have been benefiting a lot from globalization, they are now risking to become the losers.
Well, Professor Qinduo, let me get your thoughts on that. Is this now a clear sign that the steam is getting out of globalization, that lack of global leaders at the World Economic Forum this year?
Yeah, I agree with my colleague. If you look at the, let's say, last round of globalization, it is mostly led by the United States. But now the U.S. is going alone, dealing with their trade issue in a bilateral way, because that's, that's part of the American, the principle followed by Trump administration, America first. In bilateral deal, U.S. as the largest economy, in whatever deal, they will take they will enjoy the advantage of the scale. But right now, European Union and China or India, they are not completely ready to show the leadership. Although they are promoting, continue to promote globalization and multilateralism. I would say at this stage, yes, there is a strong wind against globalization. And at the same time, there is a new stage of globalization, mostly promoted by or pushed forward by the new technologies, for example, 5G, AI, robotics, etc. That's also the theme of this round of Davos Economic Forum, actually.
Right. Ken, your thoughts on that, because Africa has largely not benefited really from globalization over the past 70 years.
Absolutely. I think there's a flavor of globalization that's changing. If you look at the world from 1945 to really 2016, we saw globalization was essentially big multinationals working with the G7 economies to really spread their influence across the world. But looking at the world post-Trump, we see a new world where America is more inward-looking, and as my colleague says, nobody is ready to take the mantle of global leadership. From an African perspective, it almost seems that this is a new horizon to begin a new conversation on what is a place for Africa. So we always have to remember that globalization can only work when nation states are in a stable equilibrium, which is not the case right now.
Right. Gert Laporte, one of the strong voices from Europe was that of Angela Merkel, and she talked about having reforming institutions, but also through consensus. How do you think this consensus is going to be built if that dialogue of 2019 continues to be about multilateralism and protectionist policies?
Well, let me be clear, Europe is very committed to multilateralism. I think it's one of the strongest supporters of the UN system, of a rules-based system. In that sense, the European Union is quite different these days from the United States. So Europe is looking for allies, which it can find maybe with countries such as Canada, Australia and others. But at the end of the day, there is a major problem in Europe as well, and in the whole Western world, and that is that Europe has always been arguing and pleading in favor of free trade. But we see that a number of people in our own societies, with the globalization and with the moving out of enterprises from Europe to low-wage countries where there has been economic growth, but that a number of people here, workers in Europe, people from the lower middle classes are getting increasingly frustrated. But I think if there is one lesson that we have learned from the whole globalization effort so far, that is that we did not really take account of those who are at the losing end, and that we did not really take account of the growing inequalities that have been created. Inequalities in Europe, inequalities in Africa, inequalities in also Asian countries.
Ken, let's look at this sense of, discontent from the anti-globalists, because according to the Organization of Economic Development, OECD, China is in the process of surpassing the US economically. 35% of the world growth from 2017 to 2019 will come from China, 18% from the US, 9% from India, and 8% from Europe. By 2050, the top 5 largest economies are most likely, according to that study, to be China, India, US, Brazil, and Indonesia. Could this be as a part of why there is a lot of some anti-globalization sentiment, though, coming from the United States, for instance?
Absolutely. In fact, some estimates say growth from China, contribution of China's growth to the global economy is almost 40%, higher than the 35% that you've mentioned. There is a feeling that globalization is asymmetrical, that it only benefits some members of the global community at the expense of others. Think about it. What is globalization? It's really access to free mobility of labor and capital. How much easier is it for somebody from the US to China to travel across the world? It's very easy. But look at an African citizen who's trying to fly from Nairobi to Sierra Leone. It's an extremely expensive flight, full of visa processes after visa processes. We talk about globalization, but really from an African perspective, it's much more difficult to travel to Washington, to Beijing, to London if you're not among the Kenyan elite, if you're not among the South African elite. So that people are sort of arguing it's time that people felt the trickle-down economics.
Geert, Laporte, your thoughts on that, though? Is the anti-globalization sentiment coming up as a result of the changing economic powers of some nations?
Yes, that's definitely the case. As I said in the beginning, those who were the winners a few years ago risk to be the losers now, and they react with protectionism. But I think we should look at Africa more particularly, because Africa is probably the continent that is losing out at this moment most. I would say that there is or there has been an economic boom in Africa, but when we look at it more closely, we see that the economic growth in Africa, which is quite spectacular, that it is lagging behind the demographic growth. And there's a whole range of issues there that need to be resolved and tackled up front. I think if there's a top 3 of priorities, that we need to first look at the demographic growth and demographic explosion. We need to look also at the climate issues, because Africa is more affected than any other continent in relation to climate. And thirdly, I think it's quite important, it does not go for all countries in Africa, but there is still a governance issue in a number of countries.
Professor Xu, let's look at the theme of this year's World Economic Forum, though, globalization 4.0, again shaping a global architecture in the age of the 4th industrial revolution, very much digitalization there. And of course we know where Africa, for instance, lies when it comes to digitalization issues. How do we then make globalization work for everybody and not just for a few that already have benefited?
Well, I think, this is a process. It takes time. For example, if you look at the industrialization process, firstly it started from Britain to European continent, then to the United States, and then it shifted to China because along this wave of shift comes with this investment, with trade, with the capital, with the people, with the the international companies. I think next round of industrialization seems to me it's shifting to South Asia and Africa. African continent has richness in the resources and also has rich labor. So this should become this one of the most attractive a field for, to attract foreign investment. You can create a competitive environment among African nations to attract more investment, to attract more technology, to create the best environment for investment. With the investment, you have creation of jobs. With the creation of jobs, you have a better life. When people have a better life, you have a more stable society and more prosperous society.
Right, Professor Xu and Ken and Geert Laporte, we'll leave it there for the moment, but do stay with us. We'll take a short break now. When we come back, we'll have more on the future of globalization and Africa's role in it. Do stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
The conditions have never been so favorable for Africa to take the lead in shaping its own global agenda. For too long, we ceded responsibility for Africa's agenda to others, with some individuals even benefiting. But challenges relating to migration, security, and climate change, among others, mean there is no longer any actor who sees an advantage in an African Africa that is institutionally weak and economically stagnant. I don't think it benefits anyone. Put differently, everyone benefits from a stronger, more united Africa, and this is reflected in the more constructive tone of Africa's partnerships with Europe, China, India, and others. But no one is going to transform Africa on our behalf. It's definitely up to us.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, that was Rwanda's president and the African Union chair, Paul Kagame, speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos last week. Still with me, Professor Qinduo from Beijing, senior fellow at the Pangwell Institution. From Brussels, Geert Laporte, Deputy Director of the European Center for Development Policy in Nairobi. Ken Gichinga, Chief Economist at Mentoria Economics. Ken, let me start off with you because Paul Kagame there talks about the conditions having never been so favorable for Africa in taking the lead for shaping its own agenda. He talks about how for long Africa has ceded its responsibility to others. And he adds that others did not make it alone, so Africa shouldn't be allowed to make it alone. Do you agree?
Absolutely agree. When Barack Obama visited Kenya in 2015, he said African solutions can only be found by Africans themselves. And for some historical reasons, we've never really been able to get into what are the issues affecting Africa and what are the homegrown organic solutions that we can do, whether it's innovation, whether it's technology. We've really been crowded out by the Western voice, what you'd call really the Washington consensus, the IMFs, the World Bank's aids. So I think what is happening right now is there's a whole new climate coming up. And a lot of people are saying this could be the second Pan-African wave that could change the narrative in Africa. So what does that mean? It means, think of a country like Kenya, think of innovations like M-Pesa that have even not yet really been really established in the West. People are coming. Mark Zuckerberg was in Nairobi only a few years ago to come and learn about M-Pesa, you know, how mobile innovation can change the world. This is the change of narrative that most young people are looking for. And the demographics, as my colleague said earlier, is very much in favor of Africa. Almost 75% of the demographics in these countries are below 35 years, and they're coming into this conversation with clean hands and really understanding the historical imbalances that have clouded that conversation. So for me, I think it's an exciting time. It's scary for some people because people are saying it's cloudy, there's no room for global. There are no thought leaders who looked at this scenario, but I'm saying this is a time to really talk about what's the African intellectual contribution to this conversation.
Right, Professor Shu, your thoughts on that? Other countries didn't make it on their own. It is the time to help out Africa, according to President Kagame. Do you agree?
Yeah, I tend to agree, but of course, being led by Africa does not mean Africa will go alone. Africa needs foreign investment, needs technology transfer, needs the new ideas from other parts of the world. I think the other parts of the world, they do have this responsibility to invest wisely, to invest in a more cooperative way, where African countries need, and also to transfer their technology, the most advanced technology, to share them with African countries, so to help the countries to develop. And I think that's necessary. And also, of course, with economic independence, with the growing independence, then a political independence of African countries will be strengthened, will be ensured. So that's very important for African countries to develop their economy overall.
Right. Gert Laporte, your thoughts?
Well, I think that everything what has been said, I'm in full agreement with that. But I also would like to mention a quote of one of the leading African private sector persons who also has his own foundation, Mo Ibrahim. And he has said in his last report of 2018 that African governments have failed to translate economic growth into improved sustainable economic opportunity for their citizens. That's quite a harsh statement, and it does not come from Europe, it does not come from the US, or it does not come from any other part of the world. It's a leading African who has been saying this. And I think there is a trend in a number of countries that is going in the right direction, but there's also other countries in Africa where things are not going that well, and where you see that the space is shrinking for those younger generations that are highly talented, that have fantastic connection with the modern world, but they do not always get the opportunities that they merit. There's a number of countries in Africa that are taxing, for example, social media. These type of things are not necessarily providing the right incentives to some of these younger generation that could bring about development in Africa. I think in the longer term, what Africa needs is to find a solution for the demographic growth issue. It is an opportunity, but it's as well a major problem. But at the same time, the continent should invest more in manufacturing and making sure that it can add value added, that it does not remain any longer dependent on low productivity agriculture.
Right.
And this requires very strong institutions and strong leadership.
Africa has failed itself. You got a point. Your thoughts?
I think Africa is at a turning point. Africa has realized you cannot have economic growth without building institutions. If you read great books like Why Nations Fail by Aksemoglu, Democracy as Freedom by Amartya Sen, everybody agrees that it's time for institutions to be built. So when I saw DRC for the first time having a peaceful handover of power, in as controversial as the circumstances were, for me I was, thank goodness we are still moving, the dial is still moving forward. So stability in countries such as Sierra Leone, countries that were war-torn, now they're talking about innovation. So I think it's all about building constitutions that really talk about intellectual property, contract enforcement, and a sense of justice. And if we can get that right, then I think we will see the biggest demographic, we'll talk about the demographic dividends instead of the demographic bomb.
Professor Shu, I know you're going to leave us in a moment, so I do want to get your final thoughts on this, because the chair, Klaus Schwab, said that it is time to make globalization benefit the losers as well. That has been a running theme at the World Economic Forum. But then again, you have to ask, against the backdrop of national interests now taking precedence, how do you benefit the losers of this?
Well, let me first respond to my colleague's mention of strengthening or building the institution, I have a different opinion actually. Yes, people would say we first needed to have strong institutions, for example, rule of law, IPR protection, excuse me. But look, first of all, you should do is really a strong national leadership and with a consensus on economic development as the national priority. You attract investment, you attract the technology, you attract the people, and then you develop, as you develop, along with your development, you will develop your other system mechanism, for example, to protect intellectual property rights, and also to build a stronger rule of law practice. But you cannot wait to get prosperous until you build this strong mechanism. I think that's the Chinese experience. IPR protection at the beginning is was very weak. It's getting stronger and stronger as the country develops. You cannot wait until you have a stronger IPR protection to develop your technology. That's impossible. That's ideal, but impossible. We have to be practical.
All right, Professor Su Qinduo, we'll leave it there for you. But thank you very much for joining us on the program. But I do want to close with Paul Kagame's question there, and a closing question to you, because he has been asking, are there common interests which we can define together to restore a moral center to multilateralism? Of course, as we know that Europe is for, has been quite strongly for multilateralism, but the United States is not. But is there a consensus here? Are there common interests that we can all share in?
There are common interests. I think one of them is realizing that the youth in all these African countries, there's a high level of youth unemployment, almost 40%. So for these young people in all these countries to be integrated with the global value chains, it means that African countries have to be given an opportunity to manufacture. We import almost everything we have in our African countries. We don't support manufacturing. Yes, it's part of the Big Four agenda here in Kenya, but really it's not in a meaningful sense. If you look at a company like Bata, for example, that once made shoes here in Kenya, right now they have to import everything from India, because only then is it possible for them to be competitive, because if it's homemade here, the pair of shoes will cost 9,000 shillings. But if they import the leather from India and they import the shoes and just label butter, they can sell it for 3,000 shillings. And the market, we're in a very price-sensitive economy. So the Kenyan will always go for the cheaper shoes. So we really need to find out how do we improve manufacturing so that we can attract youth to come and to give them meaningful livelihoods. That is a common interest that we have to really have at the center of our economic model.
Right. Geert Laporte, you have the final words on this. Do we have common interests that can restore the moral center of multilateralism?
I think we have a very, very strong common interest. Europe is very much interested in what is going on in Africa, and not only for the reasons of migration. There is definitely lots of opportunities on the African continent, and we share a similar type of multilateral concern. Europe and Africa are working together on the SDGs, on climate issues, on peace and security issues, in measures to curb migration issues. So there's strong common interest. What we need at this moment now is that we change the tone of the partnership. It always has been a North-South partnership, a relationship of dependency, a relationship of donors and recipients. And this has to change quite quickly, because at the end of the day we are all in the same boat and we have a strong common interest. This means that Europe should also withhold from patronizing attitudes when dealing with Africa. So these are the things that we need to nurture, and then I'm sure that we will have a bright future in the next years to come.
Very insightful thoughts indeed, gentlemen. Thank you very much. We'll leave it there for the moment. And that's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests for their insights. Professor Su Qinduo from Beijing, Senior Fellow at the Pangual Institution. Geert Laporte from Brussels, Deputy Director of the European Center for Development Policy Management, and Ken Gichinga in Nairobi, Chief Economist at Mentoria Economics. We'd love to hear your feedback through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. And do keep the conversation going and tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Bye-bye.